When I first got back into the Atari ST many years ago, I remembered that my favourite desktop was Gemini. And Gemini is the granddaddy of all Atari 32-bit desktops. So I went out and I looked around and I found the floppy disks for it, and I installed them. And what appeared on the screen when I ran it for the first time was this, which really wasn't what I remembered. Sort of seemed familiar, and I knew that I'd used this desktop at some point in the past, but that definitely wasn't the Gemini I expected. I mean, for example, one of the things that got me when I first ran it was I thought, okay, I'm going to pull up the console window and do some console stuff. And then this window popped up. I mean, very nice, very attractive, nice font, but I can't move my mouse. I can't access anything. It's like I'm locked in. So I exit, and now I've got my mouse back, and I can close this window. But again, that wasn't the experience I remembered. After that, I went on to install near-desk Genie E's and all sorts of other desktops. And if you've seen my Battle of the Desktop series, you'll have seen those too. I think I actually said in one of the videos that I must have conflated several desktops in my memory of Gemini, and so I gave up on it. Now recently I went digging around the forums and download sites again, and I realised that I'd installed a Gemini I, and what I think I remembered was Gemini II. Or Gemini 1A, or Gemini 1.999, because it was there all the time hiding in plain sight. So let's give it a run and see what we get. Now first of all, there's a charming welcome dialogue that, well, reminds me of something, shall we say. After a bit of tidy up and renaming of files, here's the desktop in all of its glory. Now on the desktop there are these three special icons: the clipboard, the trash can and the shredder. The difference between the trash can and the shredder is that the shredder deletes things permanently, while trash can deletes are recoverable. So if I drag this file onto the trash can, and I open it up, my file is still there, so I can drag it out. However, if I drag a file to the shredder, I get a warning about the permanent nature of the delete. Ooh, scary. Which I'm just going to cancel. And kind of the last feature of the core desktop that I want to show you for now is that you can drag and drop files onto the desktop as you would expect. Then running the app from the desktop is the same as running it from the original folder. And dragging and dropping of files onto the desktop icon is supported as well, as we'll see later when we talk about the AV protocol. Okay, so let's do our usual desktop review stuff and tour the menus. So starting with the About dialog, it's worth noting that the English translation that I found on the forums is, well, a partial translation, but more than good enough for use, and the version number here is shown as 1.A. In other files in the README, this is shown as 1.99. So this was a version that was cooked to ship to developers so they could test their software for compatibility with Gemini II, but then Gemini II was never finished, and that's a real pity. So who knows where it would have gone on to from there. Really, this is a beta build, but while it's a beta build, it's a solid build, with some exceptions, which I'll talk about later. So heading over to the file menu, we can create a new file or folder. Now at the moment that will go into the root of the C drive. Open will open whatever is selected. So if it's an app, it'll launch it. If it's a file, it'll open the associated app. Show info shows information about the selected item. For drives, it allows you to set the display name and the volume label. And that's how I set the names for these drives down the side. What it also allows you to do is set shortcuts for drives. So here I'm going to associate the Alt-0 shortcut to drive C. Now as usual, you have to save your desktop for changes to persist across reboots. Now I don't always show saving it, but bear in mind that you have to. So I've given all these others the shortcuts of Alt-1, 2 and 3. So by clicking Alt-0, then Alt-1, then Alt-2, I can cycle through the drives. And if I want to open a drive, say drive F, I double tap the shortcut key for it, which is Alt-3, and it opens. And you can also do this for apps. So if I do show information for Everest on here, I can set its shortcut to Alt-9. Now I'm double tapping at Alt-9 and up she pops. All very nice, all very easy to set up. Now we have Close Folder. Close Folder actually goes up a level, which is not necessarily useful on a menu, but having it on a menu does allow you to have a keyboard shortcut associated to it. So therefore, you can get shortcut navigation that way. Gemini is really heavy on shortcuts because it's, I think, predominantly was a developer's desktop. Close window does exactly what you think it does. And cycle window is a feature that I always look for in an Atari desktop. So let's open a couple of windows using the Alt key. Pressing Ctrl W allows us to cycle through those windows, which is kind of useful. Now format is only available when you have a floppy inserted and selected. And finally, quit Gemini, quits Gemini and goes back to TOS. Now, in the edit menu, we have a lot of confusion and some real broken beta functionality. So here in the edit menu at the moment, paste is available, even though when I copied a file earlier, it wasn't. It just sort of appeared eventually. So I'm going to ignore copy and paste for files, I think, for now, and we'll look at it later for text. So let's have a look at undo. I'm going to create a temp folder and drag it into the trash. When I select undo from the edit menu, it doesn't undo. What it actually does is open the trash folder. So now if you drag the folder out of trash, it'll copy it back. But it'll copy it, not move it. So it'll actually still be in the trash can. If you want to move it out, you need to control drag the file, and that makes it a move rather than a copy. We'll see a preference later that allows you to empty the trash can when you quit Gemini, which is something I normally enable. The other quirk here is that delete here shows the dialog with the hand, so it's not moved to trash, it's goodbye forever. And as you can see, the trash folder is empty. So yeah, the edit menu is the one bit of the Gemini beta that's definitely ground under repair, shall we say, and I recommend leaving it pretty much well alone when it comes to the desktop. Now onto the view menu. The view menu has the usual options for large icons, small icons, and display as text. And there are a couple of things I like to check for with view options. So if I select small icons in the window for D, does it set it just for that window or for all windows? And the answer here is all windows. So very much in the vein of TOS rather than, say, NeoDesk, which had separate view settings per window. Definitely a thing I prefer. Another thing I like to check is, how does window resizing and text mode work together? I hate it when a desktop starts showing a column of files before you can see all of the information for that file. But as you can see here, it works like a charm. Now, there's no option to force single column display mode for text, which I kind of like. But you can sort by name, by date, by type. You can also set sort to none, a useful option to see what order your files in the auto folder will execute in. What you don't see in this menu are options to actually display those attributes that you're sorting by. So to set that, we need to select the display menu option. And we have to be a little careful about what you've got selected when we select that menu option, as it's contextual. It sets the display settings for the File Explorer window or the console window, depending on which one is selected. In here, we can select the font that we want to use in the window. Now, Gemini is the font that was distributed with the desktop, so let's try that. And I think that's a pretty clean font. We can also set the attributes we want to see. I'm going to show everything but not time. And as before, it resizes when it needs to. Right, I've reset my display back to the original settings, more for the sake of continuity than anything else. I do prefer the Gemini font personally, but which idiot do you think screen captured the wrong screen and had to re-record that bit after I'd done the rest? I can't think who. Back in the menu. Wildcards allow you to filter files. There are some pre-canned filters, and the very first one on the list is one that shows star.c and star.h, and kind of once more underlines the fact that this was a developer's desktop because they're the files you use for the C compiler. Let's filter for sys items, so star.sys, and there they are, 2 of them. What I don't see is any way of moving this filter into that list at the top. You can change an existing one to your mask, but not add new ones, so I guess it had a limited number of slots, or perhaps this is just a bit of UI that was going to come, but never got done. Finally, there's Snap to Grid, useful for tidying up your desktop if you don't have this permanently enabled in your preferences, which I do. And I will cover preferences a little bit later. Onto the extras menu, where, as usual, the sexy stuff lives. But before we get to that, if you don't mind, could you hit the like button if you like this video, and if you enjoy my content in general, perhaps consider subscribing as well? Now, I don't know if subscriptions help the dreaded algorithm, but they help my motivation. Back to the stuff. Install drive allows you to perform quite a few actions, actually. You can add a new drive. However, on my machine, all of the available drives are shown. You can set the icons for the drives here. So let's select C and set its icon to a slightly less big and cluttery one. And if you notice, you can actually also set the shortcut here. All of the changes that you make in this dialog are batched together and applied at once. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change all the icons for all of my hard drives just quickly. And I'll speed this up or skip it depending on how the edit goes. And there we go. The desktop looks a little bit less busy now. Install application allows you to configure what files are associated with what applications. So let's take the text editor Everest as an example. I want Everest to be associated with all .sys, .text and .inf files. We can specify the attributes of files. Not started from the console prevents execution of TOS and TTP apps in the mupfel window, down there, the console window, which we'll talk about later. An app marked like this will execute full screen. Is a gem app is useful if an app is installed but does not have like the .prg or .app suffix. Wait for key press after execution is useful when running one of those full screen TOS apps if you want to be able to look at the console output afterwards, because otherwise it just disappears and the desktop comes back. Marking the app as understanding VA start protocol indicates that it knows about the AV protocol. And in particular, VA functions are server, in this case the desktop Gemini, to client, in this case our application Everest. And it allows them to interchange messages. So when a file is dragged onto an app, the VA start message allows Gemini to pass the path to the drop file into the app. The AV server protocol also allows clients to talk to servers. These are the VA series of messages, and we're going to see the use of that later when we're running the command shell. The VA protocol is present in Genie, MXDesk, Ease, Thing, you name it. But it was invented in Gemini I. And that's kind of why I consider Gemini to be the granddaddy of them all, because it's the one that has enabled inter-process communication from desktop to applications. Let's save the desktop and try out our associations. That's all working as it should be. I'll skip over install icons and backgrounds for a little bit because I'm going to give them a good treatment later. Let's look at preferences. You can set if confirmation is required for copy and move, delete, or overwriting a file. Finally, reading a GIN, that's a Gemini configuration file. Now, this bottom section configures the use of Cobalt II. Now, Cobalt was a file manager similar to Midnight Commander, I guess. And its great strength was its speed compared to TOS's use of GDOS to perform those operations. And Cobalt had its own built-in low-level file system manipulation routines. It's kind of indicative how fast that app is, in that it's worth the overhead of launching another app to copy more than 5 files. So it must be good. I should do a video about Cobalt one of these days, and I shall. Let's look at the options for running programs. Now, Start's overlay allows Gemini to stay in memory when loading up an app. That way an app exit Gemini doesn't need to be kind of completely reloaded from disk, but that may cause compatibility issues and does consume extra memory. As earlier, you can specify that the waste paper basket is emptied on exit. You can enable or disable confirm on exit. And you can specify that the desktop should be saved on exit. Now, I'm conflicted on this. I hate it when I quit a desktop having forgot to save and then having to redo all the changes I've done next time. But equally, the end state of the current session is rarely the start state I want next time, so I do kind of leave this off. I just wish there was an option to save preferences on dialog close if OK was pressed. Right, miscellaneous options then. Show hidden files. I mean, the obvious question here is, how do we set a file to hidden? Let's have a look at icdboot.sys as an example, because this is a file you might definitely want to hide if little hands might be on the keyboard or mouse during the session. So looking in info for the file, there's a checkbox to mark it as hidden. So that's how we might use this show hidden files. Snap window and snap icons to grid are permanently enabled for me. If they're not, you can, as I showed you earlier, go to the view menu and select snap to grid. Small text for icons is not the font size, it's display them in lowercase. Again, a little unsure on this one. I'm kind of used to all caps on the ST, but your mileage may vary and my opinion may change. Console window will show the console window if you don't already have one open. And Save Desktop does what it says, as we've talked about many times. I'm going to talk about the console in a bit, so we'll skip that. It's kind of prettification time, so let's look at background options. Now on a colour monitor, you can set the background colour. Not that matters here, we're in glorious monocolour. You can pick a pattern. Say we want the desktop to appear darker, we could do this. And on a colour monitor, you might want to set a solid background colour. Black's just a little too goth for me, so let's put that back to where it was. We can also select an image for the background. Gemini comes with a single image. Now, I found a collection of tiled images online. They're okay, I haven't tried all of them by any means, but if we want a single image that's smaller than the display, we can just centre it. And if you don't centre it, Gemini will tile it. Now, we can use palette from the image for the desktop. I don't know how that would affect icons. Of course, either way, we need to tell Gemini to use the picture. Okay, that's not tiling magnificently, but this was a colour image. And some of these images will be better than others. Let's have a look at number 2. Yeah, somewhat better. Back to the gradient until I find an image that I prefer. Also, to bear in mind is that the picture takes up memory, and on a 1 megabyte machine, that's a precious resource. If your machine doesn't have a blitter, that might also be a thing. I'm just going to open the console again for no other reason than I feel uncomfortable when it isn't there. Now, one of the most fundamental features of a Gem desktop replacement was the ability to edit and set icons for applications and files. The icon editor in Gemini is pretty good. The only negative to it is that I can't find a way of adding new icons to the set. They're fixed. Now, I know that I used to do this, so I presume that there was a third-party resource editor of some sort that I haven't managed to locate yet. But if you know of one, please let me know in the comments below. Right, let's start by amending an existing icon association. And I'm going to choose the text editor icon. Double-clicking it gets you into the properties for that icon. Now, each icon has a large and a small version, and you can specify if your rule is for a folder or for a file. You can set the foreground and background colours for the icon. Now, I meddled with this a little and found it only really worked in low-res mode, and the changes only took effect post the restart of Gemini. It was a bit odd, but I didn't think it was worth spending much time working out how it worked. Right, so I am not using QED in this build, so let's associate this icon with the Everest editor. When we close out of the icon editor, you can see the icon has changed, and it's based on the target app, not the alias. So if I go into info and rename the alias to be just Everest, after all, we don't need an extension on it, as you can see, the icon stays the same. Our image files don't have an icon yet, so let's see how we create a new icon from scratch. We'll do that by dragging this placeholder into the list, double-clicking on it to edit it, and the wildcard for this is going to be start.image. And we'll find an icon from the list of available ones. We'll pick one that looks vaguely like an image. I think this one will do nicely. And we OK out of that, and there's our new custom icon working for files. Now, there are lots of predefined rules, as you can see from that list before, for C and .h files, and they trigger when you create stuff. So here I'm just creating a little games folder, and voila, it already has an icon. Now finally, let's create a rule for a folder to see that working. So I'm going to create a rule for the folder Everest. I'm going to mark it as a folder rule, pick a suitable image. And then there we go. And with that, we've covered pretty much all of the desktop features. So now I want to move on to the last part of this really, which is we have a look at the Gemini console. And the console in Gemini was called mupfel. Just to point out something that should be obvious to you, that between recording the last segment and this, I was having fun trying out the backgrounds, and I found one I really like. Out of the box, the console comes with some built-in bash-like commands. And the help command lists them. Here they are. And it contains all the requisite commands like ls, cp, rm, and loads more. In fact, it's a fully scriptable environment with if statements, while statements, that sort of stuff. It's the environment I use for LaTeX and tech, and that's the document creation system that I use to do my undergraduate and postgraduate theses on. The folder you start in is your user folder here, and in there's a profile script that gets executed at startup. So let's open that using Everest. And we can see it's doing many things. I'm not going to cover all of them, but it's setting up the path where it goes to look for commands. And here you can customize the prompt. The drive map variable is important. It specifies what drives are used by the Unix-like tools. So for example, DU and DF, which by the way aren't included by default. I'm going to add my E drive to this, but I wouldn't add my Gem-DOS F drive for two reasons. The first is that it's huge and it will be slow to act on, but the more important reason is I don't fancy letting potentially incompatible software screw with my Mac hard drive, right? I don't mind a rogue tool blasting away the image of the Atari operating system. That I can rebuild very easily. So there's some settings here for the folder that tools use for temporary files, and I'll most likely move these onto my data drive E at some point in the future. And that if statement in there hints at, as I mentioned earlier, that this is a fully functional programming language, or scripting language, if you want to call it that. At the very last, it outputs "Welcome to Gemini" in German. So I'm just going to change that to English for the next reboot. And here we are, post a cheeky little reboot, and there's our localized message. When we have a look in our bin folder, there are only a few commands: blip mode, cat, cookies, and more. And we could do with a lot more than that. Now on the floppy drive that Gemini came with, there's a self-extracting archive of text tools. So let's copy that self-extracting archive into our Gemini folder. And run it to extract it. I now notice that it's running inside the mupfel console. Again, this is an example of that tight integration between the console and the desktop. These are some very solid text tools like cut, WC, which is word count, split, lots of stuff. And it's also adding some man pages, which I don't doubt are going to be in German. And yes, they are. Now, there were disks full of Unix commands around back in the day. You know, disk commands like we mentioned before, DU and DF, compilers, all sorts of stuff. And I'm going to have to hunt down some of those before I release the disk image for this on my website, because, you know, I want it to be a more capable system. Now, mupfel has some features that were quite rare pre-mint. So going up a level in the hierarchy on the file system and typing a few characters and pressing tab shows that we have auto-completion. Mupfel also has a history of recent commands, which is very useful. And pressing the up arrow and down arrow allows you to browse the history and select the command to run from it. And here we're running clear. That might sound basic to somebody vested in modern Unix environments, but back in the day this was awesome. I mentioned the AV server that Gemini introduced earlier in the video, and its original purpose was to give tight integration between the desktop in Gemini, which was called Venus, and the console, which was called mupfel. And of course, mupfel plus Venus are the twins, and hence the name Gemini. To show that tight integration, I'm going to create a file on D, and I'm going to call it victim.txt. Now I'll switch to the D drive in my console, and I'll list the files, so I can use the built-in copy and paste functionality in mupfel. In this case, the edit menu works. Now if you look up at the D drive as I delete the file, and it's gone. I mean, okay, that might be a bit of a so what moment these days, but pre-AV server, that would have required you to force refresh the gem window using escape to see the file removed. Last little bit, let's have a bit of fun. So recently I discussed extended resolutions in Atari. Gemini and Emutos seem fine. So let's have a quick look at Gemini running at 1024 by 768 in the 16 colour mode. And there we are. I'm just going to full screen that. And just how nice is this? I mean, there's not too much to say here. It's colourful, it's usable, and when you're running an app, that extra screen real estate makes a significant difference. Okay, I mean, I'll pop up ST guide. I mean, bear in mind, I haven't set these colours up on this thing, so they're a bit ick, but yeah, they could be fixed. So what is my conclusions on Gemini II beta? It seems really strange to have gone through so many desktops to get to where I metaphorically started. This version of Gemini was the one that I recalled. The one that had the best integration of console and desktop, that was only surpassed when Mint came along. I mean, to be frank, I love it. But the question is that just nostalgia calling? And the answer to that is probably. Is this the best desktop for the Atari ST ever? Well, that'll have to wait until the finale of the Battle of the Desktop series. And that's going to take quite a while, because I've got a lot of setup to do for that. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you soon.